Okay, so this week we begin chapter 4, which is the second part of the book, and it is called Terror from Above, and it is about the actual terrorists. Okay, so this is a typology used by Martin, and he calls it terror from above, and it's basically terrorism that is sponsored by the state. So we're going to go through this chapter, and we're going to discuss some of the different states that have been accused of supporting terrorists and some of the definitions that he uses um, to explain exactly what terror from the state is, and that it's not a new phenomenon. It's not something that's new to history. It's something that dates back quite a while. So the state-sponsored terrorism paradigm that Martin uses is the patronage model or the assistance model. And a paradigm is just that. It's a model or an example, and it's just another fancy word to explain what a model is. So terrorism can be used by governments against domestic targets and or international targets. Terror acts are carried out by unofficial agents or proxies of the state. And for examples, in the book, he uses some paramilitaries, um, and he uses East Timor as an example in the book. In more recent times, Libya, Iran, and currently the state of ISIS have been accused of using terrorists and terrorist proxies against other countries and against their enemies. So, um, one of the bigger and more prominent groups has been Hezbollah, and they were in fact sponsored by Iran. So, throughout the chapter, Martin gives examples of state sponsored terrorism. And so, to understand it, you have to understand the many types and degrees of violence that the state uses to terrorize sometimes its own people or um, people that it's trying to influence. State sponsored terrorism may include warfare, general warfare, genocide, assassinations, torture. Genocide, um, Saddam Hussein was accused of using chemical weapons on the Kurds and committing genocide. And in the book, there are several other examples which I want you to read um, about genocide that was committed by a state against its own people. So the linkages between a regime and terrorist range from clear lines to murky, deniable associations. So some groups, it's clear when an investigation is done that the group was sponsored by the state, and in other cases, it's not as clear and it's murky, and the lines between whether the state is actually sponsoring the group um, are vague, and it gives the state the ability to deny that they're involved. The United States has accused Pakistan sometimes of um, sponsoring terrorist organizations, and Pakistan is our ally. So it creates a political quagmire when a state is involved, um, possibly in supporting terrorists and terrorist activity. So I think as we move forward, I think that we're beginning to see that the study of terrorism is quite complicated, as we've seen in the previous chapters when we studied definitions, when we studied causes. There's quite a bit of scholarship involved in the study of terrorism, and it's not a subject that's easily defined, and the causes are not easily discoverable. So it is quite a complicated um, field of study. And then when we throw in the possibility of state sponsoring terrorism, it becomes all the more complicated. Again, so we've said that a paradigm is a model, and so there are several paradigms that exist to explain state terrorism. One model focuses on a state's role in terror and a counterterrorist environment. Sponsorship is promoting terrorism, and it's enabling people to train or commit the acts, and they also cooperate in counterterrorism. Another paradigm focuses on political violence and the state being highly organized into violence and assisting in genocide, assassinations, and tortures of individuals. And when we look at these groups, we often refer to them as paramilitary organizations, and we'll talk about them a little bit later on. Okay, so another paradigm, the third one, is that the state initiated violence is waged to oppress opponents um, who might threaten the established order. So sometimes a state, rather than wage an all out war against an opponent, might use terrorist activity or terrorists to um, deprive an opponent of the ability to rise up against its own government. Okay, so now we're going to look at the state, the patronage model, and the assistance model, and the difference between the two. And the looking at how terrorism is controlled so closely by the states, by a state, and how it affords them deniability, because the more murkier the nexus, the easier it is for them to deny um, that they were involved. Also, one other thing about terrorism or state-sponsored terrorism, it's relatively inexpensive for the state to wage a terroristic campaign against their enemies within domestically within the state. It becomes a little more expensive when they become active internationally, but even then, it's still much less expensive than actually waging a full-scale, all-out war. So the state patronage model can be used both internationally and domestically. And so a government uses its subversive activities to a proxy, someone else, either in another country or within a state. Um, and the patron, the state, is able to deny its involvement for in the activities that the proxy is committing. So the consequences of the state utilizing terrorists through a group are oftentimes the consequences are not great, because the it has to be proven either domestically or internationally that the state is actually sponsoring the group. So the more murkier and the more um, the harder it is to prove the claim, the consequences for the state then are not as great. In the book, he talks about Nicaragua, and it's a very interesting case. And I recommend that you do some reading about Nicaragua, because the consequences were international. Again, the United States, we sponsored Somoza against the Contra rebels, and eventually it led to the Iran became involved, the Iran Contra scandal, which I won't talk about here on the um, tape, but you should go back and do a little research and read about the Iran Contra scandal, and what happened at that time in the 1980s. Again, the United States was backing a regime, and the regime was using terror, a terror campaign against the people to change them and influence them to back Somoza. Okay, so the example used in Nicaragua, the United States supporting those rebels, sorry, that country against the rebels, that was an international case. Um, Domestically, a government might employ security forces or police, their police forces, to maintain order, and oftentimes those police terrorize their own citizenry. The book, for example, uses the Ba'athist government in Syria to put down a rebellion by the Muslim Brotherhood in the early 1980s. But some folks have argued that in the United States history, that the Ku Klux Klan has been a patron of some of the southern um, governments down there, which were complicit in allowing them to operate, and sometimes because of the veil of secrecy, sometimes local officials were actually members of the Klan. So some have argued that the Klan actually could be also be used as an example of the patronage model. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the assistance model, and it sounds almost like the patronage model, but the state it will arm and train and provide sanctuary for terrorists, and then deny that they're doing it. Um, and oftentimes, we countries know that they're doing it, but in some places, like Afghanistan or in Pakistan, they have what's known as lawless regions. I don't know, maybe in the United States it's hard for us to wrap our heads around that, but they have regions that are lawless, and these groups are are training, and oftentimes the governments are providing sanctuary to these groups, and rogue members of their own military are involved in training them. So then, when something happens, the government um, oftentimes will deny any involvement, but in reality, we know that these countries are supporting these groups. So in the book, we talked earlier about Nicaragua, and what happened was the country found out that we were supporting the Contras against the Sandinistas, against the rebel regime. So the Boland Amendment in 1982 forced the United States to cease supporting and giving monetary and financial aid to the Contras. And so a Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who became a national sensation, um, devised this elaborate plan. Um, in the book, it's called a scheme, in which $30 million was channeled to the Contras from the proceeds of arms sales to Iran. So it became known as the Iran Contra scandal at the time. So Iran was at war with Iraq at the time, and it was a lengthy war, and so they needed arms, and the United States actually supplied arms to Iran to fight against Iraq. How ironic that later on we would actually invade Iraq. At that time, though, we were selling arms to Iran for in order to um, so that they could wage war against Iraq. Actually, Iraq was our ally. Saddam Hussein was our ally, even though we were secretly funneling and channeling funds to Iran so that they could buy weapons. So, indeed, when people say it's a tangled web we weave, that was the case in 1986 and 87. They also were pressuring Iran and it's the terrorists that they were supporting in Lebanon to release Americans that were being held hostage. Hostage taking was a very lucrative ploy back then in order to finance terrorist activities. They would often take hostages and sell them back, although the United States didn't negotiate. Secretly, they did, and they would support these groups monetarily because we would pay to get our hostages back. So when this whole scandal was revealed by the media, it was a sensation, and it led to congressional hearings, and that's where Oliver North became a household name back in the 1980s. And it also all support for the Contras ceased at that time. So patronage support, assistance support, both were ended after the congressional hearings. Sorry. So domestically, the state um, may support sympathetic proxies to um, directly or indirectly repress destabilizing forces. So if the country is undergoing a possible revolutionary or an uprising, the state may support proxies to put down the dissidents and without the actual government um, putting the dissidents down, because what happens is it makes the regime, it gives the regime the air that they're allowing dissident activity to occur, um, so they're not so totalitarian, but in essence they're using proxies to put the possibly, if it was an uprising, to put the uprising down. On page 84 of the book, uh, Martin uses the Cultural Revolution that occurred in the 1960s, mid 60s in China, as a example of the assistance model. So I urge you to read page, I'm not going to go through it, page 84, the Great Totalitarian Cultural Revolution. Um, read about that, and that will end part one, and I'll pick up in the next segment on part two of chapter 4.